2 months before 1960 commenced, Stanley Kunitz in Harper's Magazine redefined the word experimental to mean the inevitable resistance to any prevailing style for the sake of keeping it supple. Yet at the time of his writing, the turn of this new decade, quote, the nature of that resistance is in effect a backward look, unquote. This recent Pulitzer Prize winner added, quote, this happens, October 1959, this happens not to be a time of great innovation in poetic technique. It is rather a period in which the technical gains of past decades, particularly the 1920s, are being, this is 1959, are being tested and consolidated. By using the phrase the 20s, Kunitz was referring to modernism's heyday. He meant expatriation, he meant avid rule breaking, he meant aesthetic hijinks coinciding with social high hilarity. The 60s, starting now, starting soon, he averred, would be a time of modest consolidation rather than of experiment. Kunitz's historical generation would make better sense as a lament if he had been seeking to position himself as an inheritor of modernism or had been commending the avant-garde. But Stanley Kunitz was certainly not an experimenter, nor did he hope for the ascendancy of heterodox verse then or later. He gratefully noted widespread popular praise among adults, quote-unquote adults, of Robert Frost. On January 20th, 1961, flash forward to the end of our year, that genuine conservative, Frost, would somewhat confusingly conclude the year in question traveling to Washington to help inaugurate a supposedly make-it-new sort of U.S. president. Poetry took center stage, political center stage, momentarily at the culmination of the election year we celebrate tonight, or mark tonight, and yet, as Kunitz lamented at the beginning of the year, quote, I don't detect many signs of Frost's influence among the young, which I guess would be the opposite of adults, the young writers of 1960. Instead, disappointingly, the new poets, quote, have found it easier to raid, R-A-I-D, to raid William Carlos Williams. In short, modernism had become the new status quo, a false stand-in for politically relevant traditionalism. Faced with Kunitz's impressionistic and entirely unevidenced assertion that a pivotal, quote, pivotal year was a time of consolidating and standardizing the modern poetic mode, it remains for contemporary poets and the occasional literary historian to construct specific bibliographical and interpretive contexts for testing such claims, eschewing grand cross-generational generalizations, such as Kunitz's own, that tend to follow the largest contours that occur at any given moment along the continuum of aesthetic ideologies maturing and then waning at different rates of speed. Whereas Kunitz contends that resistance, his word resistance, had by 1960 become retrospect, had become a longing rather than a looking forward, a literary history operating from such a constraint, preferring deep to wide, as we, I think, prefer deep to wide through tonight's format, might serve as a resistance to such a sense of resistance. To be sure, listeners, viewers, and readers of tonight's presentations will hardly be shocked to learn, through consideration of actual lines and stanzas of poetry written and published in 1960, that Kunitz was plainly wrong when he contended that experimentalism had become static and had reached a dead end. But they might be surprised at the extraordinary degree to which he was indeed misguided by an anti-modernist ideology, which held that it had to be and should be celebrated as a dull and derivative time. Our listeners and readers might be startled too by, conversely, the remarkable dynamism and ardent heresy in the new poetry of that moment, by the freshness of the late work just then of aging high modernists, such as Pound, who was making a sort of comeback with Thrones in '59, and by Marion Moore and Bob Perelman dissents, and we'll talk about that later. A comeback of sorts, I think I said, and by Moore, Marion Moore, who put out a great book in 1959, by the subtle mix as opposed to rejection or exhaustion of modernism in emergent works of postmodernism, and by the unshy awareness and progressive consciousness with which young poets defied gloomy and mature predictions of the coming end of ideology. The title, sociologist Daniel Bell's book, arguing that, quote, among the intellectuals, the old passions are spent, also published in 1960. Bell's titular phrase had already moved quickly into common use by those affirming political centrism and rejecting as immature all forms of, quote, apocalyptic and chiliastic visions, unquote. At the dead end of ideology, no longer does social reform have, quote, any unifying appeal, nor does it, quote, give a younger generation the outlet for, and this is in quotes, within the quotes, self-expression and self-definition that it wants, unquote. From roughly 1945, some would argue 1939, to the end of the 50s, modernism's association with cultural and political heterodoxy in the 1930s had been condemned, sometimes with an hysteria borrowed from or the same as McCarthyism, and a fantasized, cleaner, purer, pre-political modernism was sought in, for instance, 1920s writing, I put that in quotes, this is the 50s version of the 1920s, to redress that alleged imbalance. In 1960, we see, I think, a surprisingly sudden turn against the logic of that Cold War era separation, against the designation of advocates of the old passions, in Bell's terms, as terrible simplifiers, and concurrently an explosion of poetic activity, and rather than a culture war between modernists and emergent postmodernists, new American poets, beats, New York school writers, latter-day Dadaists, and surrealists, post-Duchampian and conceptual poets, and others, we discover that a disorganized, an entirely disorganized, but nevertheless effective collaboration of historically distinct avant-gardes now prepared seemingly to restate cultural and political terms that after 15 post-war years of consolidation, Kunitz's term, had become idiomatic, naturalized in the air poets were supposed to breathe. So I asked a group of today's poets to breathe again some of that air. They were asked each to reread a book of poetry published in 1960 and to write, in effect, a retrospective review, a brief critical reassessment 50 years later. A short one, too, no more than 750 words. I will not introduce them in turn nor in any detail, but will identify them along with the book each reconsidered, and then we'll leave it to them each to take a turn at the podium. After these 11 mini-talks, I will moderate a discussion. You are invited to make comments, both general and specific, or to ask questions of the group or of individuals. The commentaries themselves, but also a selected and edited transcript. Where's Michael Nardone? It would probably be Nardone who will do it. A selected, thank you in advance, Michael. He came the furthest away from, how close to the Arctic Circle? North of the Arctic Circle. Just on the Arctic Circle. That's how important this event is. It took him, what, 39 hours to get here? Dog sled, etc. The commentaries themselves, but also selected and edited transcript of the discussion, will be published later in Jacket 2, as will a set of responses I will commission from people who are not here in the room with us tonight, but who will have listened to the event when it is posted on Pen Sound as a recording. After the presentations and the discussion, there will be a reception with delicious food and presumably, Jessica, lots to drink? Moderate amounts? Lots. That did not get recorded, I don't think. How much is that, says Charles. Do you have any whiskey for Charles? We don't. So now here are our poets. Bob Perelman on the New American Poetry. This is not the order in which they'll go. This is just the order I have block copied here. Bob Perelman on the New American Poetry, edited by Donald Allen. Ron Silliman on The Opening of the Field by Robert Duncan. Rachel Blau DuPlessis on Second Avenue by Frank O'Hara. Chris Funkhouser on Stanzas for Iric Lezak. Do I say Lezak? Or Lezak? Nobody knows. By Jackson McClough. Lezak. Thank you. Erica Kaufman on The Location of Things by Barbara Guest's, her first book. Barbara's Guest's first book. Judith Goldman on The Bean Eaters by Gwendolyn Brooks, and that's coming to us by video from Chicago, because Judith, it was kind of hard to get here, so she's got a little video. Kristen Gallagher on preface to a 20-volume suicide note by Leroy Jones. Who's read that book? It's an amazing book. Danny Snelson on Cartridge Music by John Cage. Michael Hennessy on A New Folder, edited by Daisy Alden. Charles Bernstein on My Eyes by Larry Eigner. Mel Nichols on Hymns of St. Bridget by Bill Berkson and Frank O'Hara, the aforementioned. He gets 2. Kenneth Goldsmith, who could not be here tonight, has written and sent us a retrospective review of Who Wants to Guess? Brian Geisen and William Burroughs, Minutes to Go. So we begin, and thank you for coming.